What is up, Rooks? Welcome to the stable. I'm your host, Rookie Pilot, and today we are working on some pretty cool upgrades, no pun intended, but we are working on the cooling system for that 66 sitting behind us. And some of you might think,
oh, the cooling system that was engineered by Ford in the 60s is already really good.
Yeah, but we're in the state that constantly catches things on fire, trash cans are melting. It is currently 107 degrees outside and climbing. So yeah, any cooling upgrade is gonna help these cars out tremendously. I've had overheating issues on an inline 6-cylinder of these, as well as a 289, and both with a combination of mechanical and electric fans, so it's just godly hot out here. Anyway, on to our first upgrade. We got a 17-inch Flex-A-Lite fan. This is just gonna help pull more air through that radiator. That, along with the shroud that we have, should be pulling in a little more air. Then we have our cool overflow tank. This is just a really cool design that I've used in the past. It's just an overflow tank that looks cool. And onto our main upgrade. This is a 4-core aluminum radiator from Summit Racing. The build quality is pretty good on that radiator. I've used it in the past on the Little Red project. Once again, not sponsored by any of these companies. They're just items I've used before in the past and I like using. But we're also gonna be installing an aftermarket temperature gauge. Since the gauge on the inside just has low and high, you don't really know what temperature you're at. Also, some of you might be asking,
well, why don't you just get an electric fan and be done with it?
Well, I've tried that. I've tried that on both the inline 6 version of these as well as the 289, and there just isn't enough space to get a big enough fan in there. They are either too thin to be powerful enough to cool these engines, or they're too thick where it won't even fit and it'll hit the water pump pulley. Although there is a major modification that can be done to these cars to fit a bigger radiator in it. I think we're actually gonna try that on number 3, but as for this car, this is what we're going with. So, small update, we got the radiator out fairly easy. One thing I did notice is there is some like rust deposits in there, so it was already a bad flowing radiator. Anyway, we got the old radiator out as well as the fan. One thing to note is that the old radiator is about 2¼ inch thick, where the new one is about 3 inches thick. So that means that we're gonna have to mess around with fan spacer sizes in order to get the correct distance, which is 1 inch from the fan to the radiator. The fan spacer that came off of this car was a 2½ inch fan spacer. I have an array of fan spacers from my other projects, but I have this 2-inch fan spacer that we're gonna try on and see what our distances are. And to protect the new radiator fins, I cut a cardboard to size and taped it around just so when we're installing it, we're not hitting it and bending all the fins up. The owner also gave us this fan shroud to use, but these fan shrouds are notorious for not fitting and for being bad quality. Like you can just see how good quality these are. So we've come across our first issue here. The 2-inch fan spacer pushes the fan a little too far back where it will come into contact with the AC compressor pulley. So 2-inch fan spacer is not gonna work. This fan also takes up more area width-wise from blade tip to blade tip than the stock one. I'm going to put on the 2½ inch spacer that was already on there. I tried it roughly and it looks like it might work, but I'm gonna bolt it down and measure our distances and make sure we have enough clearance. All right, so we've made pretty good progress off camera. I actually ended up using the shroud. I was able to make it work, and it was a pretty simple solution. Our fan depth is halfway into the shroud, so that's exactly what we want. As well as the fan is about 1 inch, 3/4 to 1 inch away from the radiator. So the brackets that came with the shroud were too small for the radiator that we put in, but the simple solution ended up being just add some spacers, and I had to trim a little bit of the shroud on the bottom to clear the fan. The fan shroud is so small and thin that its effect is questionable, but being Arizona, even if it helps us out with a couple degrees, it'll be worth it. So now that the aluminum radiator, fan, and fan shroud are installed, all that's left to do is to add this aftermarket temperature gauge. We're gonna be running both the original and aftermarket temperature gauge in this car just for added redundancy, I guess. So we ran into a slight issue with the temperature sensor. This sensor is too long and it hits the thermostat before actually seating where it's supposed to be. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna switch the original thermostat over to this side and the aftermarket one to this side. Right, so now that we've moved the sensor locations, this one now has room to go all the way down where it needs to be seated. But with the relocation of these sensors, this creates another issue. The wire for the factory harness is only long enough to go to this location, so we're gonna have to extend this wire by about 6 inches. So once again, we extended this coolant temperature sensor wire, and for anybody that's wondering why I went with green instead of the original red, this wire actually said water temperature sensor written on it, so what more fitting than that? So now that we have the temperature sensor situation sorted out, wow, that's a tongue twister, there's one thing left to do, and it's to find a location and mount this guy. So in the previous Little Red build, we mounted this guy right alongside the radiator, but since this one has AC, we can't do that because this line is in the way. Okay, so I think I want this overflow tank to go about right here, and I think the brackets that came with it should allow that. It's not in the way of anything right here, and it's pretty close to the radiator. So I think this would be a good location. Wow, I just noticed they cut the living hell out of this radiator support to fit this AC line. So this overflow tank took way longer than I would have wanted it to. I had to remove the entire hood latch mechanism in order to pull back the AC condenser enough where I wouldn't poke it while making the holes for the brackets. By the way, would anybody be interested in some Rookie Pilot decals that we have here? Okie doke, the overflow tank is now in. That took a lot longer than I expected, but our install is now complete. All that's left to do is to fill her up and give her a test drive. Also, let's not forget to take out the piece of cardboard that we put in there to protect the fins. That was actually the first time I tried that cardboard trick, and it worked perfect. None of the fins are bent. First time. I am very curious on the differences between the aftermarket gauge and the original gauge, because the original only shows low and high, and the aftermarket gauge actually shows you numbers. So I want to see what the low means on the original and what the high means. We're trying to torture test this car, and we get a cloudy day this time. It hasn't gone above 170, which relative to the original gauge, it's not even halfway across the original gauge. Okay, so our temp is hanging around right under 180 degrees, and I've been driving it for about 25 minutes. And we still haven't gone above 180 degrees, so I say these upgrades are pretty damn successful. So I've tried city driving, stop and go traffic, and we're chilling right at 180 degrees. It's pretty damn good. So our temps are looking amazing. We haven't even gone above 180 degrees, which is outrageous still. I've been driving it for a while. I'm sweating. My body's hotter than 180 degrees right now. All right, so this test drive concludes that these upgrades are in fact working. We stayed at a cool 180 degrees. We are still gonna test this out some more tomorrow when it is hotter. But what I was really interested to see was the comparison between the factory gauge and the aftermarket gauge. So at about 160 degrees is when you see some movement out of the factory gauge. At 180 degrees, we were about a quarter way up the factory gauge. And at 200 degrees, we were a little bit over halfway on the factory gauge. So I would assume once it gets to the hot side, we're running about 230 to 240 degrees. That's when you should consider it overheating, but we didn't get anywhere near that, so that's really good. Anyway, that's just something I found pretty interesting. So these upgrades will help in this Arizona heat where the summers reach 115 degrees. But that concludes this episode at the stable. I'm your host, Rookie Pilot. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys on the next one.